Hi everyone, welcome to the virtual coffee break with Mark and Karina. And today we're going to be talking about Amazon advertising readiness. So last week we spoke about making sure that your listings were retail ready. Today we're going to be talking about advertising and how retail readiness sinks into your overall Amazon strategy. So Mark, you are the advertising guru on this call. So I'm going to pass most of this conversation over to you. But what do we mean? So we know what we talked about retail readiness last week, but what do we actually mean by advertising readiness?
Yeah, good question, Karina. So the two are interlinked to some extent. Advertising, as we know, is really a must if you're on Amazon. Gone are the days where you can list a product and more or less leave it there to start making sales. So advertising has a real fundamental role. There are numerous advertising options both on Amazon and outside of Amazon. We're primarily going to talk about Amazon PPC, or the sponsored advertising capabilities, but the discussion points we're going to go through today and the key considerations can be rolled out across a wider things. As we know, in episode 4 last week, we discussed retail readiness, and of course, elements of retail readiness fit into the advertising. So I won't go into huge detail on this because you can listen back to episode 4. But to kind of cover the basics from an advertising perspective, you want to make sure you have the following 3 things in place when it comes to ads. So we talked about inventory. That's important, right? Can't start an advertising campaign, building campaigns, setting up goals, setting up creative to then have an issue with stock. So inventory is really important. Only advertise when you're comfortable that there's enough inventory in place that you can fulfill orders.
Yeah.
Secondly, buy box. So again, you've got to be winning the buy box. If you have many distribution partners that also trade on Amazon, but they're winning the buy box, you could partly be funding their sales. For some companies, that's okay. For most, they're not a fan of that. So make sure you're winning the buy box. And reviews, which we'll touch on a little bit later, but reviews are ultimately important as well. You want to be promoting products that have at least 3.5 stars and 15 customer reviews. I do get asked quite a lot of questions that should you use advertising to promote newly launched products? Yes, is the answer. But you cannot expect the same level of conversion as you would get from products that have good reviews. So if you have some of those things in place beforehand, it will thumbs up, it'll make life a little bit easier.
Great. And I guess that's also when it comes to making sure that your listings have all the bells and whistles that we talked about last week as well, because that will, I guess, impact your advertising, the success of your advertising as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a reason why it's like baking a cake. You've kind of got to follow a structure. And if you miss out any of those important ingredients, or if you do something quicker than what you should have done before, the end result's not going to be where it needs to be. So retail readiness, making sure your pages are all optimized. The reason we did a separate podcast or a webcast of that last week was because it needs its own time. It's really important you have that. The fundamental role that advertising plays, you take it to its basic level, is that it's finding eyeballs that are relevant for your product and driving them to the page. Advertising doesn't guarantee a sale, but it's about influencing that person's decision-making process. And you're going to increase your likelihood of a sale or attracting a new customer if you have all of those steps in place. So retail readiness is absolutely crucial for that.
And I guess that's what we always get asked, right? That question, as in when we start dealing with an account that might be new to seller, their question is often, how soon do we run advertising? You know, do they run it as soon as they've started up on seller, or do they leave it for a period of time? And that's when we often say, well, actually, let's just get your listings retail ready. Then we can start setting up those advertising campaigns as well.
Yeah, it's an important question, and actually there's a lot of conflicting advice on there. My opinion is that you get your stores, your retail readiness done first. And in the same way that if this was bricks and mortar, you wouldn't invite customers into the store whilst there's scaffolding and building works internally. You would only want your customers to come into your store once everything's complete brand spanking new, everything's in order. So the same is with Amazon. If the first month of a project is around listing optimization on titles, bullet points, description, images, then you're better having that in place. And then let's say in month 2, launching a wider marketing plan to start driving traffic to those pages. So absolutely, I think that's fundamental. But I think you can also kind of moving on from there. There is a term that we know is Amazon advertising readiness, which is the kind of next step after retail readiness. And a lot of sellers and vendors that we speak with miss out the kind of 3 fundamental takeaways that you need to have in place for this. So I'll go through that in a little bit more detail. First one I had in mind was about what role is the advertising playing here, which is essentially KPI setting. So are you looking for the advertising to be the main conversion tool, or is the advertising playing the role of increasing awareness of that product? And this, the best advice I can give to anyone in a short period of time is the first thing to do is decide where your product features in the product life cycle. So if we think of launching a product, growing a product, profitability and liquidation. So if you have launch, growth, profitability, and liquidation, which one of those 4 does your brand fall into, your products? If you're new to Amazon, or if you have a new product that's launching, then it's going to fall into the first part, the launch phase. So you need to have KPIs and goals that are in line with that. For example, someone that's launching a new brand will most likely take a more aggressive strategy at gaining new customers and gaining awareness than someone who has a well-established product that has great market awareness, and actually they don't need to be as aggressive with their strategy. They can have lower bids and they have a good conversion rate. So it's really important that, and there's ways of doing this, of course, structured ways of doing this, that you understand where do your products, and sometimes you'll have a case, Karina, where you'll have 10 SKUs and they all fall into different areas, and you actually should have different strategies. The common mistake that a lot of brands make is that they have all these products and they have one strategy, and that doesn't really work.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a really good point, because that's often what we find when we do talk with brands, and maybe they're not new to seller, but they're new to working with us, for example, and we're devising what the best strategy is for them on Amazon. And a lot of them don't seem to have actually an advertising strategy, or they're taking that blanket approach and by not really understanding it, they're looking at the wrong metrics. They're focused on ACOS, yet they haven't even created any awareness, and they haven't even got to the potential of the amount of clicks that they could get. And and it can be really conflicting. But as you say, even in your own range, there could be so many different strategies according to where the products are in that life cycle.
And that's a skill of a consultant or an agency. What you really want any agency to do is to do a deep dive of your products. They should be asking you, where are you? So if we're working with a new brand and their products have no exposure, then we're going to have a launch strategy in place probably for the first 6 months at least, which will be more aggressive than say, right, people are now more familiar with your brand. We don't need to be as aggressive. There's maybe still a big focus on attracting new customers, but how are we now building customer loyalty through adverts? How are we doing that? So it's really important that you have that in place. Step number 2, one that I quite frequently talk about in my presentations, is margins, understanding your margins. And this relates to your KPIs. So doing some basic maths, you want to understand what your pre-advertising gross margin is, or in other words, your break-even ACOS. You need to know what that is, because you can link that into your objectives. So for example, I'm going to pick some numbers out the sky. If my break-even ACOS is 40%, and so that's my pre-ad gross margin. So it's 40%. And my primary objective is launching a product and gaining that new traction. We may advise, or Amazon may advise, that you actually aim for an ACOS target of 50% to 95%. And when you look at that, you'll be, well, wait a minute, my break even is 40%. So if I'm aiming for 50 to 95%, I'm at a loss either way. And that's important you understand that, because quite often, in order to get the sales velocity that you would need in order to be successful, there might be a period of time where you actually need to fund a loss within your advertising. It's not always the case, but it's an important thing. And of course, the more margin you have, and depending on where you are in that product life cycle, would typically dictate what ROI and what ACOS you should be aiming for. So the ACOS that someone's aiming for, if their sole focus is on profitability, is very different from someone at launch stage. So I would always say that getting your margins in place is fundamentally important from that side of things.
Yeah, definitely. And you do find, again, this is this whole thing when we start speaking to brands and you ask them and then they're not actually sure how much they have to spend. And the question is, well, how much should I spend to be able to get X and Y? But then when you sort of go back and it's more that sort of bottom up, okay, well, you could spend X amount, but what actually is your margin requirement, and building it based on that. But a longer plan as well, as in, okay, because people get scared, right, to think, oh my God, ACOS of 90%, are you kidding me? But then knowing that long term, that's not the goal. The goal is to drive awareness, and then is to kind of stabilize that, right?
Well, if you launch a product, if I launch a male grooming brand, let's say, the reason I picked a male grooming brand is because I need a shave and I need a haircut. So it's the first thing that came to mind. So if I launch a male grooming brand, but I set my campaigns up to have a low ACOS, let's say in my books 20%, let's say 20% is a really good ACOS, I will potentially stunt the sales growth that I could potentially receive, because I'm giving Amazon a choice. I'm basically saying, Amazon, you cannot convert customers who are 20% more expensive. You have to stay down at this level for conversion, which will slow down my sales growth. And we know that Amazon's algorithm is geared up to volume and sales. They're not as interested. Amazon's not as interested in your profit margin. It doesn't really care about that. So that's why it's important that when you launch a campaign, you have to at least be aiming for break even, but aiming too low on the ACOS or too high a ROAS would fundamentally potentially slow down your sales growth. So I think you've got to really just kind of plan in for that. There are cases where we do launch brands and that isn't the case. They end up being extremely profitable from the beginning, but you're playing into market conditions and situations like that as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And then finally, just kind of to wrap things up in threes. So campaign creation, a lot of questions are asked around, how do I set my campaigns up? What structure should I follow? And really it depends on numerous things. It depends on your margins. It depends on how vast your product range is. If you're traditionally a catalog business and you have hundreds or thousands of products, it's probably going to be fairly difficult to follow what we would call a 4-to-1 structure, where you've got an automatic campaign, you've got a branded, category and competitor campaign, so you kind of have 4. You could do that, but you're going to have thousands of campaigns. So grouping campaigns is important. I would say that the one kind of style that we like to follow is the 4-to-1. So you do have the branded, category, competitor, and you use that auto campaign to really just keyword harvest. So, you know, when you're building a campaign, you'll do an element of keyword research anyway. You'll maybe put in 20 keywords for competitor, 20 for branded, 20 for category, but you've then got that auto campaign that will identify in search term reports other keywords that people are converting from. That's a really good structure. It's actually regarded as an advanced structure, albeit probably not in my head, but overall it's advised as an advanced structure.
I guess,
and then
just jumping in, I guess on that strategy, that is because your ACOS will almost, your metrics are going to be different, right? If you're going after branded versus a competitor or a generic keyword.
Yeah, so your branded conversion rate would typically be higher. You'll typically have a lower ACOS on branded conversion as opposed to competitor, where a customer's already typed in the competitor, they're more likely to buy that. But if they switch, but you'll pay that premium to get that new customer. So yeah, in reporting, you quite often, we like to review ACOS on that level rather than just total ACOS. It's good to see what total ACOS is, but actually what should my ACoS be for competitor campaigns versus branded? And that's really important. And that will allow a good and efficient optimization team to put in the right changes. So absolutely. Like, you kind of got to split them out into the three and measure them, but you can also get more adventurous in that. So once you have that base foundation in place, you can start breaking off into other niches. Maybe you create a niche of campaigns that are focused on fitness or well-being, and you target keywords. I see a lot of campaigns created where they'll actually take underperforming keywords, keywords that are relevant for the industry, but maybe this brand hasn't had traction on them. So what you do is you take them out the wider campaign, you plug 5 or 10 of them in their own campaign, and you can start to really play around with that. So campaign creation is really important, and never be afraid to change it. You can change it over time, but remember that Amazon's sponsored advertising works best with smaller changes happening on a regular basis rather than larger changes happening on a regular basis from that point of view.
And I guess the structure is vital, because the amount of times when I've seen accounts and some go, yeah, look at the search report, our campaigns are doing really well. And then you check the campaigns out and it's just, everything is just bundled in. And it doesn't really tell you anything. And they're like, it's doing really well. The ACoS is really well. The ACoS is fantastic. And then when you break it down, they've got no traction at all on anything generic. The only traction they have is on branded.
On branded.
If they have such brand, there's always that argument of how much you push it. But then it's completely distorted the data, and actually can be quite misleading almost.
Yeah, because there's the argument that, well, if someone's searching for my brand, they'll buy anyway. I would say most brands do run branded campaigns. Some brands don't. Amazon encourages competition. So if you're not bidding in your brand terms, someone else will. I think it's a good way to cross-sell. I much prefer having a presence of a brand on there rather than a competitor. But like you say, it can be a little misleading. So that's why having the correct campaign structure not only allows easier optimization, but actually from a data standpoint, it will allow you to review things a bit easier. At our agency, we use additional software, so we very rarely rely on Amazon's console, and we find it quite old-fashioned and quite difficult to work with. So we use software that helps us do all of this, and I suppose jazzes up the reporting for us, but it's a fundamentally important part. So I would say that campaign creation, is a ton of advice out there. It depends on your number of SKUs. It depends on your marketplace. Never be scared to have too many campaigns. I don't think that's a thing. Unless your budget's very restrictive, you can have lots of campaigns. It will give you more data insights. But the sky's the limit when it comes to campaign creation.
Yeah, cool. And I guess that's interesting. Like, those are the 3 key points that you've raised on Amazon Readiness. And often people go straight into step 3, right? As you've just said, the KPIs and sort of figuring out what are going to be the main metrics that they focus on when launching those campaigns, and actually the margin aspect. It's almost panic post campaign creation. And I think people just sort of jump in, create those campaigns, and then all of a sudden haven't worked out what their margin is, and looking at the wrong KPIs, and also realize that the structure of the campaigns is completely unmanageable, right? And tough to...
So if you don't do the first 2 steps, what happens is you get a little bit excited, you launch your campaigns, and then you realize, oh, this isn't going the way I needed it to. The reason that you set the KPIs up beforehand, and the reason that you work out your margins, is it might actually work out in the sense that, do you know what, I'm going to launch this in stages. So I'm going to start with automatic campaigns, or I'm going to start with just sponsored products. I'll maybe then add in sponsored brands, which is typically more of an upper funnel awareness format. I'll maybe add that in month 2, because by that point, I'll have been taking advantage of that lower purchase funnel formats anyway, and I can use the data learnings there. So if you don't do the first 2 steps and you launch everything at once, do you really understand what each role formats are playing? I would argue no. You're making that more difficult for yourself. So I think in summary, Retail Readiness, episode 4, listen back if you haven't. Inventory, buy box, reviews, get them right, have a plan of action. Move on to advertising, KPIs in place, work out your margins. There's different ways of doing it. We have our own customizable spreadsheet that makes it really easy for brands to do. They pop in their product, they pop in their price, their cost of goods, and bang, it comes out with what your estimated target should be. And campaign creation, that should then follow off the back of that. So yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. So for hopefully those who've been listening and have listened from day one, you've already defined whether you want to be a vendor or a seller. We're obviously assuming a lot towards the seller side. Then once you have launched and set seller up, making those retail ready and then getting your advertising campaign set up. So hopefully you're going to have everything in check, ready to start seeing those sales come in. So thanks everybody for listening today. For those that haven't already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Virtual Coffee Break, and also follow us and like our page on LinkedIn, and join us next week when we talk about, well, we're going to probably, I think I'm going to say we're going to have a surprise, because I don't think we've actually decided that topic for next week, but it will be definitely one that all you listeners will benefit from. So thank you.